and free. So, now, Jung believed that the shadow is something that kind of comes apart when you face it. So it's a blurry black mass in a sense before you start to differentiate it. And so you can tell what the shadow is as far as any one of you is concerned, because you can start to notice how you aren't like you act, especially when you act around people that you're trying to impress, or people whose opinions you think are important to you. You have to pay attention to it though, and you'll be able to see that there's a distinction between what you say because you're saying something in order to make something turn out the way you want it to turn out, and what you actually think. And the shadow's at work in two ways there. One way is that it's convincing you that using your speech and actions to manipulate the world in a conscious manner is a good idea, and it's not. And the second is that you'll see that there are counter thoughts to what you think. So if you, for example, if you find yourself in the position of being too nice to someone, maybe it's a boss, for example, who's a bit of a tyrant, you know, and you don't feel that you're in a position to say anything in your own defense against his or her bullying tactics. The consequence of that is that you'll think all sorts of dark and dangerous thoughts about that person in your own fantasies when you're not interacting with them. And if you catch a hold of those fantasies and you let them play themselves out consciously, you'll see that they take you to very dark places. Now, or at least to places that you regard as very dark. So, Jung's notion essentially is that when you start to uncover those elements of yourself that don't fit comfortably within your ideas about yourself, is that you discover things about yourself that are also potentially very useful. It's as if you threw the baby out with the bathwater when you were setting up your personality. So for example, earlier I talked about people who may have decided very early in their life that they're just not going to get angry. It's like, well, it's not necessarily something that you want to throw away. It might instead be something that you want to bring within the realm of your personality so that it can express itself consciously and in an articulated manner. Because without anger, for example, you don't have any power, which basically means that no one needs to be afraid of you. And you might think, well, people shouldn't be afraid of you. And then a Jungian might ask, well, what in the world would ever lead you to believe that? I mean, the distinction between being respected and being feared is not clear. But I would say that you don't respect anyone whom you couldn't imagine fearing if they decided to make that their priority. So, without the capacity for aggression, you're not going to get any respect. That doesn't mean that people have to fear you, but it does mean that you have to incorporate your capacity for aggression enough so that they would fear you if you wanted them to. And if you think about it, that makes a lot more sense from a moral perspective than the argument that you should be nice to everyone. Because if you're nice to everyone because you don't have any choice, because you're weak and ineffectual and harmless, then that's not a virtue. That's just, you just can't do anything else. You're harmless by default. And harmless and virtuous are by no means the same thing. If, by contrast, you're capable of causing all sorts of terrible trouble, and you know it, and you know how, and then you decide not to do it because you can carefully articulate a different route, well, then you have the possibility of virtue. Because without the capacity to sin, so to speak, there's no virtue in not doing it. So, if you're a young man who feels that sleeping around is wrong, but never has the opportunity to do it, then you can hardly attribute that to your virtue. So a good Jungian would say, well, you're just making a virtue out of a vice. It's just rationalization. It has nothing to do with virtue.